Hello, I'm Lynette Mill, and I've had the pleasure of talking with Olwyn and recording some of her stories of her time in Tripura. And I think she's an absolutely amazing woman and has done a wonderful job. And I'd like to record these stories for her family. Well, Olwyn, I just want to ask you how it came about your call to the mission field.
I think possibly it was always there, which sounds a crazy thing, but we always had missionaries in the house and people coming and going on furlough and staying and then when I was a teenager there were missionaries down the road from they'd come back from the Solomon Islands, the Jenkins family, and they filled me with all sorts of stories of Solomon Islands, and I thought that the Solomon Islands was the place that the Lord wanted me to go to, really because of their influence. And then they left and went to Australia and started up gospel recordings, which was going into all sorts of different places and recording the language of the people and the stories, putting the stories of the New Testament onto records, and we played those later. And so they had a tremendous influence on me, but India was always in the background because of these people that had been there. And so I think I just grew into it in a way. When I left school, I wanted to go nursing, and my mother said, no, you're not going until you're older. And so I thought, oh, well, I'll go to Bible college first. And so I went to Bible college and was the youngest that had ever gone through the place. I think I was 17, just 17 when I went in. And then I went nursing when I was 19, and then went on and did my maternity, and would have liked to have done my midwifery on top of that, but because you had to be bonded for 2 years later afterwards in those days, I by that time applied for the Baptist mission, and that wanted me out there, and I didn't want to spend another 2 years mucking around in New Zealand. And so I did 9 months in what they called private doctor's labour ward, and I did the deliveries and things, and got the experience but didn't have the certificate at the end. And so I went out to India when I was, I think, just turned 24.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yes. And where was Bible College in those days?
In Queen Street.
In the Tabernacle.
Tabernacle.
Right.
My grandfather was the founder of the Bible College, so
Yes.
I knew the place backwards and forwards here, and had spent a lot of time there as a child.
So that was Joseph Kemp?
Yes.
Joseph Kemp? Yes, very good. And your brother also went through?
Well, he also says the same. He went through. He did university in New Zealand and got an MA, and then went to Oxford in England and got another MA, and then worked for Scripture Union for a couple of years, or a year probably in England, and then a year back here, and then was a Baptist minister in Korori, and then came up to Papakura. And by that time I'd been in India for a while, probably 5 years, and when I was about to go back, he said, oh, I think I'll be following you. And so he says that his call to mission service probably started again in our younger days through these people coming and telling us so many stories and things.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, and so he lived in central India, and then they moved to Pune later, and he was teaching in the theological college. And they spent many more years than I did there in the end, because the children went to school there, and they were educated there, and then when they came home they went back several times later, so they probably spent more years than I did. Yeah. And we met up once or twice on holiday, and they came and visited me too.
Just shows the impact a home that's interested in mission can have.
The foundation was laid. I went to rope holders for a while. We went to the Tabernacle, but my friends all went to Mount Al Baptist and they went to rope holders, so I went to rope holders with them. So my grandmother was president of of the Baptist Missionary Fellowship one time, and Mum was the local leader in the church of missions, and so it was ingrained into us both right from the beginning. Yeah,
that's wonderful.
The family that used to be the Dispensers family, they live in it now. But the floor, being, we say it was mud, it was built up. You washed it once a week with cow manure and mud and water mixed together, and with a rag you just wiped it all over the floor, and that gave it a good hard feel. And it was quite good because when babies came, nobody had nappies, so they just did everything on the floor. And so if it was just urine, it just went into the floor and that was all right. If it was worse than that, you went out and got a bit of grass and you wiped it round it and threw it out. So that was quite easily dealt with too. But the worst thing about having the tree trunks for posts was that the white ants got into it, and they would eat it inside, and you wouldn't even know that it was all rotten inside, and suddenly the roof would sag. And we got to the stage where we were having to renew so many posts every year. I asked that we had put a concrete piece around, and in the end we concreted the whole of the floor. Just that it was, in the end, it was cost effective compared with what it had been for. But we had no furniture. Well, we did have some furniture. Our beds were tree trunks and plaited bamboo, and then a thin mattress on top. And I had an apple box that I put on the wall and made shelves in it, so I had a bookcase. And a man made me a little table for a desk, and so that was quite a good setup. On the end of our bedrooms, we had a bathroom, which was a plaited bamboo floor that was loosely plaited so that the water would go through. And the man that we had there would draw water in the morning, boil a kettle of water, put it in a bucket, boiling water into a bucket, in a basket that was lined with cotton wool. And when I wanted to have a shower in the evening, it was still warm. And a shower was a God Save the Queen one with a dipper and and I didn't realise at one stage that I was having a shower. It must have happened for quite a while. The children could stand outside and through. They'd never seen it in Technicolor before. And suddenly I realised and yelled at them, they scattered. I don't think they came back, but they'd had a nice view for quite some time.
Oh dear.
The toilet was another thing. It was a long drop, and somewhere I found a box, and I put it on the top, and then I found an old toilet seat, so I put that on the top of it. And over the hole, there were bits of wood to hold it, and just a hole in the middle of it so that everything went through that. Well, I had a lady, one of our missionaries brought a friend of hers, an English lady, just to spend a few days there. And she came to me, I can remember I was sitting at my little desk. She came in the door and she said, "My friend's just fallen down your toilet." And I said, "Oh, how terrible." She said, "No, her hips were big enough. She didn't go right down." So I said, because the white ants had eaten that wood on the top, you see, so I got it renewed, and I asked the field council if I could have a concrete slab so it wouldn't happen again. And they said, "Oh, no, you don't need that. That's wood's all right." So I said, "Right, okay." So I was in Agatala for some time, and 4 of us went out there at the weekend. There was Paddy Eade and his son John, Esther Denham and myself. And I thought, I'll fix this. So I said, let's have a number system so that when we go down to Howick, the first one rings 1 bell, the second one rings 2 bells, and 3 bells and 4 bells. And I made myself the 3rd bell. And so when I went down and came back to come up again, I kicked those logs really hard, and Paddy went down after me. And a few minutes later, there was a great yell, and I said, "What's happened?" "I've fallen down the toilet." "Are you all right?" "Yeah, my hips are big enough. I didn't go down too far." Within 10 days, I had a concrete slab over by the dispensary, and we built a well down there. And so the man who worked for us would draw the water in the morning for the house, and sometimes he'd go back. Sen Babu, who was the dispenser, and he made up the medicines for us. He and his family lived beside us, and they would do their washing down there. So we built it with concrete and a slab beside it, and they would beat their clothes on that, and that was their washing. Life was pretty primitive. In the cookhouse, we made a stove. We built it up about this high with mud, and then had a hole there in the side and a hole in the top, and that was a bit smaller than the saucepan, so the fire was underneath and the saucepan was on top. I did the washing up. I put a slab of wood in the kitchen area and covered it with contact and had a bowl there, and so I did the washing up of the dishes there. And I think I had a cupboard that I kept things in.
So you do washing up with cold water? Probably.
No, he would boil the kettle up. I also had I had a great system for to have a heater in the winter, because it was during December and part of January it was quite cold in the evenings. So I had a kerosene heater. And then I had one of those tin ovens, and I would put the tin oven on top of the heater and leave the door open. That gave a great heater. And when I wanted to make bread, I could have it in the kitchen and do it in the little tin oven. We had one prize guy. He was a Riang, and the Riangs used to have miles of beads, the little tiny beads, what do you call them, that they make bracelets of and things. Anyhow, he'd have miles of those, and his head was like this, and they were hanging down here, and his hair was done up with cow manure, and it was long, and so it was all matted up on the top of his head, and he always wore a dinner suit. Well, his dinner suit, we called him the dinner suit man. I don't know what his name was, but his dinner suit was a piece of cloth about that wide that was between his legs and over a string at his waist, and that's all he ever wore. The first time he came to us, the Jeep was there. The mission owned a Jeep, and I had probably come back from being in Akatala, and the Jeep was going back that night, but he was fascinated with this Jeep, and he crawled all over it, and then he wanted to go for a drive, and so we told him we'd take him just down the road and back again, but we couldn't get him into it. He had to sit on the bonnet. And he was an amazing. He was probably only in his mid-30s, but he was just so naive. He'd never seen any civilization before, and he'd come frequently, bring patients down, and then he'd go back again into the wild. We didn't know where he came from, but after getting to know him, he didn't speak very much Bengali. He only spoke his own language. He came down one day and he invited me up to his village. And I said to Sen that I was going to go, and he wasn't very happy with me. He said, "You don't know where it is, you don't know who you go, what sort of place you're going to." But I just felt that the Lord was telling me to go, and so I went off with him. And as I went, we went down to a river, and there were pug marks of some tigers that had been there the night before. And I thought to myself, nobody in the world knows where I am or who I'm with. I sort of felt it was a crazy thing. Anyhow, we must have walked about 10 k's, went right up into the ranges between ourselves and where Elizabeth was. And when we got near to the village, all the women and children tore for the jungle because they'd never seen a white person before, and it was just too shocking for them.
Wow.
They took some time before they came out. But I'd taken with me one of these little gospel recording record players, and they were in a cake tin, and it was only about that size, and it had the story of the Good Samaritan on it, and another story. I can't remember what the other one was. Anyhow, that evening after we'd had a meal, the people all came out and gathered into the house was a long house, so there were several different families lived in it, and they all gathered in this great big building in the evening, and I played this tape recording, and how you played it was you couldn't turn the handle. If you didn't turn it at the right speed, it was terrible sound. But if you played it at the right speed, and suddenly the people heard it in their own language, it was just amazing, because very few of them they'd never seen a white person, they'd never been out of their own village probably, except for those that went to the bazaar. And they played it over and over again. And then I decided it was time to go to bed. I had the choice of sleeping in this long house with everyone else, and I thought, oh no. There was a storage grain place which made of bamboo, and it was up a pole that was a bit of a step ladder, and so I said I'd sleep up there the night. Never again would I have done that, because the rats were over me all night. They'd climb up and over the top of me, and we often had children brought in with noses bitten off for rats, or a toe bitten off for the rats and things, and yeah. So anyhow, in the morning they again assembled together, and after a lot of discussion, they said, we want to be Christians.
Wow.
And it was just through hearing this. Some evangelists went back there from time to time, but we never were able to maintain a real witness in that place. So I don't know whether they went on for the Lord in the end or not. But he came right to the very end of my time there. He still came in his dinner suit and his hair in a matted mess. In the 1940s, they had a real conviction that we should begin this work in Tripura, and the Maharaja who owned Tripura, and it was a little dominion of its own, and very remote from anywhere else, because there was Bangladesh to its south and Assam to the north, and so it was just a dominion on its own. And so they felt that there was real need for evangelism in this Tripura state. Elizabeth's in-laws were missionaries, and they had gone in several times, not through a main route but up a river, and into a village where Indian missionaries had come down and preached, and this particular village called Halbari had become Christian. And I don't know how many miles it is from Agathala. It's not terribly far from Agathala, say in those days about an hour's journey. And they had the privilege of meeting with these people and talking with them, and the evangelists that had come, and building up a relationship with them. But these other missionaries, the Eads, wanted to get in, and so they moved from Brahmanbaria to a place called Akara, which is it's in Bangladesh, but it was about 3 k's from the border of Tripura. And they lived there for quite a long time, and went across to Agathala from time to time, got to know the Maharaja and some of the government officials, and they always worked through government officials to a large degree. But they built up this relationship, and finally the Maharaja said, yes, you can come into the state and work You can build a hospital and you can have a school. And well, there was this land became available for us. I think it was about 34 hectares of land. So it's quite a big area, and you can live there, but on one condition, that none of my you don't preach to my tribe, and that none of them become a Christian. So we worked there for about 25 years before anyone became a Christian. And this is only one part of the story, but when I was living in Kulai, a school teacher came to me one day, a Tripura man of this particular tribe, the royal tribe, and he said he wanted to learn English. Would I teach him English? And I didn't think I was adequately prepared for that. But in the end I said to him, well, let's read John's Gospel together and we'll talk about we'll read it in English and we'll talk about this as we go along. And so for about 18 months he came every night and sat with me and we read and talked about John's Gospel. And then I came home on furlough and I thought, I'll be blowed to this. He's not making any move, and I don't think he's grown at all. He's learning a bit of English, but that's all. And I went back after a year or 9 months home thinking, I don't know, I don't think I'll carry on with this. I hadn't been in the house for an evening, and 3 men, he brought 2 other men with him. One was a government worker, and the other one was... I think he was a scribe or something. Anyhow, it was Shashanka was the first one, the teacher, and there was Petal, who was a government office worker, and there was Horinat, who lagged behind the others in a way. So they said, will you teach us English? And I said, it wasn't really very... they were so keen, and so they coerced me and got me to say that I would. And I don't know how long we read John's Gospel for and talked about my faith. And then they came one day with a great petition written out asking to be baptised. And that was such a tremendous move. And they'd never seen a baptism before. They wanted to be baptised in a village that was of their own tribe, a non-Christian village. And they got the village band going, and we had a great hoolie, and they were baptised there. They went from there across to the bazaar, and Shashanka wanted to buy some material for a blouse for his wife, and the shopkeeper said, no, you're not going to buy it for me, you're a Christian now. So the persecution started straight away. But they all went on for the Lord. Horinat, I never really felt that he was fully committed to the Lord. And when I visited him 35 years later, as an old man, his family were all claiming that they were Christian, but I felt it was name only. Shashanka, when I came home, and I think it might have been about 2 years later, and didn't go back again. By that time, persecution was really rising for them, and the government moved them all to different villages to break up the threesome, and in the end there were 3 different churches in those places. So Shashanka went to teach in a Catholic school, but when the last time when I saw him, he died shortly afterwards in 2004. He was dancing on the road behind the vehicle as we drove off, and he said, I might have taught in a Catholic school, but I'm still a Baptist. And he was singing away. Biralal has had a wonderful testimony, and he married a Lushar girl, and they lived in a village. It's part of a suburb of Agatala, and he's had frequent contact on the compound. He built a church, and he died of tuberculosis about 2006, but I met him again in 2004, and he had really gone on for the Lord, and it was lovely. One of his sons, James, one son had died quite young, and the other one, I don't know what happened to him, but James is in correspondence with us all the time, and with Elizabeth. She just said this morning she just had a letter from James. He wrote a few weeks ago and said that the church was known by a Hindu name because that was the suburb and I can't think the name of what it was, and he felt that it was wrong to have this Hindu name for their church. What could he call it? And without thinking very much, I just said Hosanna. So Elizabeth immediately wrote to him, so there's Hosanna Baptist is there now, and it's got quite a number of people coming along. He's had he's a lovely guy. He's an office worker in Gatala. In Chandpur with Agnes Alcorn, and the lady was, floods were there at the time, and they were up to my hips, and the machan, or the bed in which she was lying, was slightly higher. I delivered the baby, and about 2 hours later we saw her walking through the floodwaters with the baby in her arms. And later on we went back to see if the baby was all right, and she didn't like the way that I had dressed the cord, and she had taken it to pieces and put on her own way of doing it, and the baby died later of tetanus. So that was a really sad one. Was having her third baby, but they didn't think to tell me that she was coming back to our house after she had the baby, and I didn't know when it was due. And I went to bed that night, and sometime in the night I was woken up by a noise outside the door. Quick, get out of bed! I want the bed. And she'd had her youngest one. Can't remember his name now at the
Geoffrey,
moment.
I think. Geoffrey?
Geoffrey. And so I quickly changed the sheets on my bed, and she got into my bed, and I think I must have slept just in the lounge. But sometime during the night I had a feeling that I needed to look at the baby, so I checked him, and the cord was leaking. So I grabbed him in my arms and ran down to the hospital, put on another cord tie, and Geoffrey's still alive today. To a village where a lady was in difficulty, and I packed up my bag and off I went, biked a couple of miles, and then left the bike in the bush and went through the jungle to this village. And as I was going along the path, I suddenly realised I hadn't brought my scissors to cut the cord with, and I thought, whatever am I going to do? And I thought, well, they just take a piece of bamboo out of the wall of the house and cut the cord with that, so that I'll do the same. But of course I boiled it and made sure that it was sterile, and the delivery went well, and the baby was healthy and fine. I really had a calling for Tripura, but because she had put in this claim, I went to Bangladesh, and that was a good year in some ways, a totally different place to what it would be over in Tripura, which was only 16 miles away. But at the end of the year, she wanted to go to Bangladesh, and so I had the opportunity then of going to Tripura. And when I went over the border, I just knew that this was the place that God had called me to. There was long grass everywhere, and there were bamboo houses, and it just was right up my alley. But I really didn't enjoy hospital work. I was longing to do something out in the district, and so at the end of the first year in Tripura, it came up that we could start a clinic 54 miles north of Agartala in a little place, a central area called Kulai, which was a lot of Christian villages around, and non-Christian villages too. And so it wasn't in a village, it was in a centre. And so Joy Smith and I were nominated to go out and to investigate. And a man offered us some land to build a dispensary and a house for ourselves. And so we built, first of all, a little 6 by 6 bamboo with a mud floor and a grass roof little place. We had a bed in the corner that we shared, and that was our dispensary, was the little part that was left. And we managed with that for 6 or 8 weeks until we could build a house and turn that into a cookhouse for a dispenser, a man who had been a nurse in the hospital. He was of the Garo tribe, a man called Sen, and he and his family came out to live with us. So we built a house, a slightly bigger one, with a mud floor and bamboo walls and a grass roof, and a smaller one for him and his family, and a cookhouse that had been our original dispensary. And then we built a little dispensary in front. And Joy used to see patients in the morning, and I would go out and see patients in the villages, or else just preaching and teaching. And then I think it was only a few months, I have no idea how long it was, Joy's mother became ill with cancer here in New Zealand. She had to come back to New Zealand, so I was there on my own after that. And I would often live for 3 months without seeing another European.
Wow.
Sen Babu had several children.
Yeah.
He ended up with 6 children. And then one day somebody came in with a baby that had just been born in the village, and there was nobody that could feed the baby. Nobody who had milk, and there were no cows. And so they brought the baby to us and said, it can be yours. And so Sen's wife said, well, I'm having another baby now, but I'll take this one as well. And I said, well, we'll share it. And so we called her Pretila and called her Petal. And she came to live mostly with me and half the time with them. And by the time I left, she was 5. And so she was just ready for school. And for many years, we didn't have any contact with her. And then our children all ended up going over there at the same time through circumstances that we hadn't anticipated. And we found out where she was, and when I went 35 years later, I was able to meet her again, and she was a grandmother by then.
Wow.
So now she has gone back to live in Kulai, and her husband has passed away. I haven't had contact with them for a while, but yeah, she's doing quite well. But unfortunately, she was married to a Catholic person, and I don't think there's any faith there now, and it's been sad to see. Yeah. And I can't remember what tribe they were now, because in this area we had about 17 different tribal groups, and they all spoke their own different languages, but we used a trade language, which was Bengali. And the women folk largely didn't know Bengali, but the men folk all did from being in the bazaars and marketplaces. And so this man appeared one day, and he had 2 little bundles in his arms, and he said that these babies had been born and the mother had died, and there wasn't anyone to look after them. And so one weighed 1 pound and the other weighed 1.5 pounds. And so I ended up with them, taking them on. And I had them in a basket with hot water bottles and fed them with a pipette to start with. And then it wasn't too long afterwards, we had to go in for our general meetings, which we had, field council we used to call it. So I packed them up in this basket with hot water bottles and everything, and took them on an old converted weapon carrier, which was the only buses we had in those days, that were tied up with string and with number 8 wire to keep them going, and travelled the 54 miles. In the early days, that 54 miles took us 8 hours to travel. And I don't know whether it was at that long period that we earlier on, or whether it was later on that I had these children. But anyhow, halfway in from Kulai to Agatala, there was a river, and at first you had to go out of the bus and onto a Patoon and cross that river and then get another bus and go into Agatala. Later on they put a bridge there and that made it so much better, but it still took a long time to travel that road. And for a long time, well, probably even now, you have to have an escort to travel because of the fighting that goes on in the different villages. So it was quite a perilous journey. I took these little ones there, and I think we looked after them while we had these meetings on and went home, and in the end they were £5 each. And the father came and said, "I want my twins." And he just took them out from me like that. And I just about broke my heart because I thought that they won't look after them well in the village. I never heard whether they did or not. Never heard from them again. He walked out as he'd walked in, and we didn't know where he came from.
So today we've got something about animals, I believe.
Yes, I thought we'd talk about animals, but also talk about the roads in Tripura, because in the early days, and this we're talking about is nearly 70 years ago, so in those days the roads were pretty primitive and pretty up and down and ruts, and the only vehicles that were on the roads were converted weapon carriers from the war, and they were tied up with bits of string and number 8 wire, and they went or they didn't go, and it took you a long time to travel anywhere. So when we went to Kulai, at first it took us about 8 hours to travel the 54 miles, and it was really slow and boring, and many stops, and particularly when you got to Telemura, which was not too far from Agatala, there was no bridge at the river, and so the bus or the jeep that we were travelling in had to go on a little bamboo raft, which there was no room on either side. You drove it on and it just seemed to sit on top of the water, and it was taken across, sometimes just pulled across, sometimes with a pole it was pulled across. And when you got to the other side, there was a great lot of water came out of the engine and things at times, and then you carried on. And it was quite a journey to do that trip.
Did a jeep ever come off that raft?
No, it didn't. I have a photo somewhere of Paddy Eade sitting in a jeep, and you just can't see the barge underneath him, so it was just the size of the jeep and no more. But it was quite scary if you were in that situation. And then the other bridges that were around the place, often I was called out to a case during the night, and it could be in a distant village of about 5 k's, and we'd have to walk there. And often you had to go through rivers or over rivers to get there. And the men would come in from the village with a bundle of jute all tied together and lit, and that was the torch. And so they would walk in front and you would walk behind, and it would be quite good. You could get quite a good idea of where you were walking. But when I came to a bridge, which was probably a piece of bamboo across it, which they just walked across with no trouble. Sometimes there was a handrail, but it was pretty unstable, and I'm just no good at heights at all, and that was just the end of me. I had to have somebody behind me and somebody in front of me, and I hung on for grim death. Sometimes you'd have a log of a tree that had been put across, and there'd be sides put on it. That wasn't quite so bad. But at night, walking with a torch held high, a great deal in front of you, and across that with the great abyss down below, it was just too much for me at all. So those were really hard bridges. And other times bigger rivers, sometimes we just had to wade across, and I'd be up to almost my waist, often in water, to get across to the other side and then walk on. And it would be interesting because often in those places you'd see the pug marks of tigers that had been there the night before, and you'd think, well, I wonder whether they're in the bush watching us as we're walking across now. And as for animals, I suppose we we all think of snakes in India and snakes everywhere, but we didn't see terribly many snakes, and I don't think I ever saw a poisonous one, but they were probably around. But there was one memorable time that I remember. I was lying on the bed, which was just a bamboo bed, and I had a little girl lying beside me having a midday rest. And I had a bookcase up on the wall that was an old apple case that I'd made into a bookcase. And I just glanced up and saw behind a snake coiled around. And so I called out to Sen, who was the dispenser who worked with me, and called him over. And he didn't have the courage to touch it. He wasn't going anywhere near it. So Sen wasn't interested in doing anything about it. And he called a patient's husband who was in the little hospital thing that we had there for people to stay overnight, and called him over. Now I was amazed to see him put his hand over the head of the snake and grab it and pull it out and throw it on the ground, and it was dead.
Wow.
He just knew exactly what to do. It was only a small, thin one, but quite long, a couple of feet long. But yes, not very nice to see. In the jungle roundabout, and in those days there was a lot of jungle around the villages, and you'd hear the monkeys in the forest, but they never worried us. They never came down into the houses. They may have in some other areas, but they didn't in our area, and so we weren't pestered with them at all. But one day we were travelling in the jeep, and it was one of the jeeps that had cloth sides to it, travelling on the road going north. And the person who was driving stopped the jeep and said, "Look up there." And there above us on a cliff was a panther, a black panther looking down at us. And I thought, oh, we've only got this cloth roof. And he was just standing there looking at us. And we watched him for some time and then drove on. And we saw a man on a bike further on. And so we stopped and told him that there was a panther around and he should be careful because he had no protection at all. And that was the only time that I heard of a panther or saw a panther around the place. And a tiger, there were quite a few tigers in our area at different times. And one time there was a tiger being a pest in one of the villages not far away. And they asked me to go out to that village to see a patient who was sick. And as we were going along, I went to go down one pathway, and they said, "No, don't go down that pathway, come on this other pathway." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Because there was a sign back there to say that there was a trap set for a tiger, and so you mustn't go down that way." So we went into the village and saw the patient and came back out again, and I was curious to know what the sign was. And there on the path was a circle of bamboo, and through the centre of that was another piece of bamboo, and they knew by that a trap had been set, and so nobody went down that path. So I said, "Well, if you get the tiger, tell me and I'll come and see it." And so a while later they did tell me, and I went to the village and saw it, and I got a little bit of the tiger skin from it, brought it home, and later on made pencil cases for Jenny and Jeff when they were first at school, high school. They'd only lasted a day and they were stolen from them. But it was hard work because the skin was so thick. But I was interested to know how they knew how to set the trap. And they said that if you went down to the river in the morning, you'd see the pug marks of the tiger, and you measured the pug mark, and you knew by that how high the chest was. And so the arrow was set at that height to go through the chest of the tiger. And so it was quite a science, and it was interesting to see it. Because today there are no tigers around there. And then elephants was another thing. My first introduction was to an elephant was when I was in the hospital in Agatala, and it was one that the muhat brought up to the veranda of the hospital, and Dr. Zoka Moana and I climbed on his back, bareback, climbed up onto it and went for a ride on it. Oh, it was hairy and it was hard on your legs. But that was quite fun.
Goodness.
But sometime later, quite a few years later, we heard through the village telegraph, which was a cry from one village to another, that there were wild elephants in the area and they were coming in our direction. And I thought, well, I don't know what to do. And they said, light fires around the house. So we did. We lit fires right around the house in the direction that they were coming from and waited. And sure enough, I think it was about 5 elephants came up the valley. There was a little one and bigger ones. And they were just rampaging through the fields, through the rice fields, and making a real mess of them. And they came up through our veggie garden and where our well was and crossed over and went down and on to the other villages further on. But that was quite an experience to feel the fear of what the villagers were experiencing as wild elephants came through. Yeah.
So the one you rode on...
That was a tame one.
Yes. Who had tamed that?
It was in the town of Akatala, I don't know. The Maharaja would have, in earlier days, had elephants. Yeah.
How did you get up? Did you have a ladder?
And that we were standing on the veranda of the... and then I think the Mohut, the chap who owns or who works the elephant, and sits on top of him, he would probably put his hand down and pull us up. We didn't have to climb up the trunk, which is the usual way of getting
up. Is it?
Yes, the trunk will wind around a person and put them up on their back.
Oh, I see. Now, monkeys, did they ever come into your house?
No, they didn't. They were just up in the bush, which was a little way, almost as far as the bushes here from us, from the house.
Right.
So not quite as far, even a bit nearer than that, but round about that. So they never seemed to.
So you only heard them, they didn't come and steal things?
No, they didn't come and steal things.
Right.
I'm just reading a book now up in Simna where they were a real pest and they were in the house and still stealing things and then really going mad at people if they tried to chase them off. Quite vicious. Yeah.
Just wondering, Olwyn, about what were some of the things that you had to treat as a nurse out there?
Mainly, I think, looking back on it now, it was many different sorts of dysentery and malnutrition and ordinary things like that. I really was preserved in that I never had babies with noses that had been bitten off by rats and bad injuries where people had cut themselves with their cookeries. I was very fortunate that sort of thing didn't happen in our time. We had some really difficult deliveries to do with babies, and one particularly with Joy Smith that I remember. But on the whole, we had really just minor things that we dealt with. If I was concerned about any patients that I wasn't sure what to do about, Lawrence Sanson used to come out once a month and I would keep those people and they might even stay in our little place until he came, and then he would see them and give me some idea of how I should treat them. I don't know whether I've mentioned before how we gave medicines. We first of all started off with just a little bamboo building that we used for a dispensary, and then Oxfam gave us the money to build a little concrete building. It wasn't very big, but it was enough room to have a chair just inside the door where we saw the patients, and then a part where the medicines were on shelves, and Sen was there and he made up different mixtures and things, and we gave it to the people there. And then round the back there was a little private room that you could examine somebody with. And so it was only just a small building, but it was very worthwhile. It had a veranda outside and the patients sat on the veranda until we called them in. And we gave the medicines only for 5 days at a time, because people would quite likely take all the medicine at one time, and that we didn't want that to happen. So we used to go it in for 5 days. They would come with their bottle, and we made a little piece of paper that we glued onto the side of the bottle with niches in it, and the niche was 1 dose, so they knew that they could just do that 1 dose, and that would last them for 5 days. And we usually told them that you took the medicine when the sun was there, when the sun was there, and when the sun was there, and so they knew that they took it 3 times a day.
Okay.
Pills we made little, like the ice cream. You get a cone, and it's like a cone. We'd roll up the newspaper like that and make those little cones, and they were all stacked up, and we'd put the pills for everyone in those and close it over at the top so they could take it safely in their basket or in their shirt, or whether they wrapped their medicine in to take home. So we didn't provide anything that they had to return, or bottles. They supplied their own.
What would they have done? Did they have like village healers or other ways of dealing with diseases?
Yes, they did. They had different people who would make concoctions up of weird things.
And did those healers get annoyed at you coming into the village, or?
No, not really. In the end, the doctors started to come into the area, and they were the ones that didn't like us being there, and so they were quite glad when we moved off. But no, in the villages, I think they were just glad of the help that could be given. But they had some weird ideas as how they could heal things.
Sort of more superstitious kinds of things, or?
Yeah, and weeds that they would use.
So presumably your medications were much more effective than theirs, so they would have more confidence in you.
And I think that they had used their things for so many years, and they were pleased to have something else come in.
Right. Yes.
So how did you get your supplies? How did you get the medications?
It all came through. Dr. Sanson did the orders in Agathala, and then we just ordered from there. So they would come by plane.
And you were saying sometimes people stayed with you until Dr. Sanson could see them. Well, tell us about your house. I wouldn't have thought there was any space for anyone else.
On the hill in front where the dispensary was, we built a little bamboo building with a mud floor and just some bamboo beds in there, and people could stay there and do their own cooking.
Oh, okay.
And I didn't look after them or anything. Only medical, if they had a wound or anything, I'd look after that, but they cooked for themselves. And same in our hospital. Anyone that came in had to come with relations too, and they cooked outside and brought the meals into the people.
That's in Agathala?
In Agathala,
Right.
yeah. So you always had a patient and 3 or 4 relations as well.
Right. Okay.
And if anyone died, you had to bury a person very quickly because of the heat. So within a few hours of the death, they were buried. And so often somebody would come in from a village to see somebody, and we'd have to say, look, I'm sorry, they died a couple of days ago. But there was no other way of doing it.
And that was expected, though. They knew that was the right thing to do.
Yeah, they did. And we had a Christian cemetery down the road from the house, from the compound, which we used for Christian people. And others just had to take their people away or take them somewhere in town.
Now, there would have been a lot of people that, different tribal groups that spoke different languages. How did you get on when they came, to explain what was wrong with them?
Most of them could understand several different languages,
Mm-hmm.
and we used Bengali as a basic or trade language, and so they knew the men folk had a smattering of Bengali. The women folk, no, they didn't, but then the men were there to interpret for them. So we
Mhm.
used Bengali, and then somehow they just understood each other.
Mm.
Although the languages weren't similar, in some cases they all lived so close to each other that they, over the years, just, yeah.
Mm. I know other doctors have had someone sitting in with them to interpret for them. So
A
you,
husband, would always come in with the wife, and
yeah.
and he would interpret for her, or some other friend.
Okay.
They just worked it out themselves.
Right.
We
So
didn't have to
you were
provide
pretty
anyone.
you were pretty confident that
Yeah.
you knew what they were talking about, and I guess you could see the wounds or whatever.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. There were ulcers and things like that we treated.
And what technology did you have, just in terms of electricity, refrigeration, needles, or how?
Nothing.
None of that.
We had no electricity.
How? Fire, like you heat things up with a fire? Or?
When we built the house, we built a cookhouse beside it, and we built up about that high of mud, and then we made a hole in the front and a hole in the top, and you put the firewood in there and you put the saucepan on the top, and so that for a shower, we had a little boy that used to work for me, and he would boil up a kettle in the morning, and he'd put that kettle of water, boiling water, into a bucket, and then we'd put it into a basket that was lined with cotton wool, and it stayed there all day with a lid on it, and at about 5 or 6 o'clock I'd have a shower, and it was a God Save the Queen one with a dipper, and but we all, even in Agatala, all our showers were like that too.
Mm. Mm.
In the early days, I think probably until about 2 years before I left, we had no electricity, even in Agatala. We had lanterns,
Mm.
and we just worked with lanterns. Because I lived in the outside of Agatala and away from others, and everyone knew what I bought in the bazaar. I used to mostly live on curry and rice, and dal, which is lentils, and I didn't have very much meat because the only thing was goat's meat or chicken, and everyone knew if I bought that, and nobody in the village could have that. They didn't have enough money to buy things like that.
Okay.
So I didn't eat very much like that. But BMFs used to send out wonderful parcels, and we'd get parcels quite often, and we might pick 5 or 6 parcels at a time. So we'd have a certain amount of tinned food, tinned peaches, spaghetti, baked beans, tuna, all the basic things like that. Sometimes they'd send honey, but that was a bit precarious because it would break on the way in the container, and it could be through everything, and chocolate and all sorts of things that could get muddled up together. But on the whole, we did so well with those parcels. And when I became ill at any time and was in Agatala, they sort of knew that the only thing I ate was spaghetti. And I can remember getting sick at one stage and Hazel True saying, "Oh, not again, and I've got to find spaghetti." So she'd go around for all the different houses and collect it up.
Is spaghetti still a favourite?
No. But we'd made our bread in the tin oven on a kerosene heater, stove, and we used it for a bit of cooking, but most of the time our cooking was done out in the cookhouse on the little clay oven.
Did you do your own cooking, or did you
No,
have
well,
somebody?
Bino, he could do dal and rice and a funny bit of a curry. Otherwise, if I wanted to do anything else, I would do it.
In your curry, did you have any meat, any
No.
protein? So you
No,
didn't get
some
much
veggies
protein.
and bits and pieces that found around, or some tin things into it. Whatever we can put in.
It was very self-sacrificial of you to do without protein because the others couldn't have it.
Well, you couldn't do anything very much else because everyone knew what I had, and they thought I was wealthy because I owned a bike.
Did
said
they
I was
ever get to see your parcels with all the tinned goods?
I think my parcels must have come to Agathala,
Oh, okay.
and then I got them out from there. I don't think they came from. I don't remember them coming from the bazaar. Elizabeth would say that we always had dysentery. There were so many different varieties of it, and we often got things like that. The bane of our years in Tripura was glandular fever, and I think probably all of us at some stage had glandular fever, and that's the thing that I got quite severely in the beginning, and it came back and back over the years until I came home. So I think that probably glandular fever and different types of dysentery were the things that were undermining our health. In the wintertime it was quite cold in the evenings, and I had a cardigan, and I felt really guilty about the fact that I was warm and other people weren't. So I began knitting, and I knitted cardigans and jerseys for little kids mainly, and they were all striped, just whatever wool I had. So you'd see all these striped little bodies going around, and that was quite good too. So knitting, I did a lot of knitting, and providing for different ones, scarves, but it was mostly all in stripes because I never had enough wool to finish one. You had to get the wool from Calcutta, and so I just knitted up what I had. To keep warm in the evenings, you didn't have heaters, and it was just bamboo walls, and it was quite drafty. So I had a kerosene heater that had the long funnel and then the plate on the top, and I had a tin oven. So I lit the kerosene heater, put the tin oven on top, and opened the doors, and I had a heater. So that worked out very well.
Elizabeth and Gordon were living north of you.
About 54 miles north of me.
Right, and Elizabeth came to visit you sometimes.
She would sometimes come down, just that she wanted some female company, and she'd send a note down with one of the bus drivers, and it would be delivered to me, and she'd say that she would come at a certain time. She'd come by bus, and then we'd have a lovely time together. We started off the women's work. We had at one stage we had, I think it was only about 9 women for the first women's meeting of the state of Tripura state, and we took up an offering, and I think she's got the number. I think it was about 11 pence that we got.
Right.
But we thought that was wonderful. But that was the beginning of what is a mighty work now among the women, and that was started in our house here in Ambassador. I had lots of different people come. Shirley Smith would come out when Karen was a baby and spend time with me. When Franklin and Audrey Gaze separated, she came up and lived with me for a while with the 2 children until she came home to New Zealand. And then that time Margaret Griffiths came. Dulcie Guy lived with me for a short time and worked out from there. And earlier on Joy Smith was there too. So there was quite a bit of coming and going. And Paddy and Kathy would come up from time to time. And John, during school holidays, spent time with me too. So there were comings and goings. Sometimes I would go for 3 months if he didn't come each month, and I would go into Agatala then, and I would realise that I hadn't spoken English with anyone over 3 months.
Wow.
Yeah. So in some ways it was a lonely time, and yet I just loved it too. Often in the morning we had devotions. I think it was at 6 o'clock, and then whoever was on the veranda in our house at that time would stay and listen to the news. And I had a radio, and they loved to listen to the BBC News, which they couldn't probably understand terribly much of, but I enjoyed getting it too. Yeah.
When you first went out, I know you had a year at Bangladesh to start with. Is that when you learnt the language?
Yes.
Or how did you learn it?
Yes. I didn't really... I wasn't a good student of language, and I didn't have the opportunity to learn it much because we couldn't get the right tutors in. We went to language school for 3 months for 2 years. So in my first and my second year, I had 3 months up in Darjeeling, and that was a great time when we did studied Bengali, had tutors and had good people to teach us in classes, and also we went out and did a lot of trekking out into the Himalayas, and that was a wonderful time. And then both in Brahmanbaria and then back in Tripura, we just didn't find the right people to teach me, and so I really lacked in getting the right teaching from the beginning, but also I was slow in learning my language, and so I really learnt a villagey Bengali that could be understood by village people of a tribal group, and not a pure Bengali that a lot of others spoke.
Well, I think it's truly amazing the work you've been able to do.
Oh, it was a great time.
Yeah.
Loved it.
How many years were you there, or how long were you there?
13 years all told. Yeah, but and it came back several times on furlough.